They came before language had settled into its modern shapes, before kings had crowns, and before temples had yet learned to count offerings. The first fires were thought to be gifts of the heavens, and the rivers were pathways for gods who loved the earth like a child loves a toy. In that ancient, pliant world, two orders of beings divided the sky and the soil. The Anunnakis, tall and luminous, with hands that could fold mountains like cloth, and the Igigis, fleet and keen-eyed, who leapt between stars and worked the surfaces of planets as servants, busying themselves in a garden. The oldest stories said the Anunnakis were made by thought, fathers and mothers of the great firmament, born from storms and silence. They were called to watch, to govern, to craft laws of balance. The Igigis were fewer of stature, but many in number, born as assistants, sharp-minded artisans and caretakers, patient in repetition. They tended the engines the Anunnakis fashioned, the bronze gears that churned tides, the glass-lensed orreries that kept track of seasons, the webbed conduits that moved essence from root to sky. Without the Igigis' hands, the Anunnakis' designs would have been nowhere but sketches on a star wind. For ages, their relation held like a well-tended arbor. The Anunnakis built cities of light, towers of basalt and crystal where statues hummed with memory. The Igigis camped in the lower terraces, in workshops where sparks outlined the night like constellations of their own. The Anunnaki spoke and the Igigis did. In exchange, the Igigis were given food, shelter, and the hum of purpose. The arrangement had the solidity of habit and the intimacy of dependency. The Igigis called the Anunnakis hires in jokes that tasted of both reverence and frustration. The Anunnakis called the Igigis hands in a way meant to be kind. Everything changed when a drought came. The long drought. A meteorless thirst that leached rivers into memory and made grain kernels whisper fear in basements. The towers of the Anunnakis, designed in times of plenty, shuddered. Mechanical conveyors choked on dust. The glass orreries fogged and miscounted the months. Water, once pooled and given, became a currency traded in secret. The Igigis felt the thirst first in their throats and then in their sleeves. Workshops that had always hummed at night went silent. Families ate less. Children, small, nimble, quick-witted, played with dried gears as toys but could not ignore the emptiness where their meals once were. The Anunnakis, for all their height and light, found ways to preserve their stores. Some argued in heated sessions beneath the star maps that their housings required protection. Their work was of cosmic import. Without them, the world would be unstitched. The Igigis' hands would, the debates went, be spared from famine to keep the machines that kept even the lowlands alive functional. It was an arrangement that had cracks long before the drought. The Anunnakis' benevolence had always been selective. They offered knowledge in measured portions and tended to their own sanctuaries with finer threads. But the drought made those threads visible. Where once the Igigis had shrugged and continued, their resilience a source of secret pride, now their mothers began to count empty nights. The first to break the surface were not leaders nor prophets. They were a small group from the workshops by the Western Basin. Led by a being named Naru, the Igigis there gathered freighted by need and a smoldering question. What if the reason the Anunnakis guarded their stores was not necessity, but convenience? Naru was not a politician. He had hands scarred from bellows and a laugh that could still ring like a reed. His mother had taught him how to stitch brass with twined fingers. He also had watched his sister waste away while the palace rafters still gleamed with preserved fruit. The first meeting was obscene only in hindsight. Naru and a dozen others in a cellar, candlelight flickering across the gears of an abandoned pump. They spoke of fairness in the language of those who had never been heard. They fashioned a plan not to overthrow but to reclaim, to retrain the pumps and redirect the saved wells. They would do what their hands knew. They would build. They worked at night, shades of their faces bending over mounds of scrap metal. They coaxed old gears, resurrecting the pipes that had fed the palace gardens. They rerouted a small aqueduct, a subtle redirection of flow, a trick anyone could miss if their eyes were on the towers. The strategy was simple: saturation. If the low terraces received a steady trickle, survivors would not have the time nor the appetite to petition the Anunnakis. The plan assumed secrecy and swiftness. For a while, it worked. The Igigis' alleys swelled with small green things. Mothers smiled through calluses. Food came in whispers, a loaf shared here, a cup passed there. The Anunnakis noticed the change but explained it away as weather patterns shifting, as luck returning. They praised the ingenuity of the Igigis privately and allowed them their quiet pride. A few hires even descended to give blessings of gratitude, blessings that tasted at once like pity and like the patter of rain on glass. The respite bred confidence. The Igigis began to imagine a world where their work needn't be cloaked in beggary. They began to ask not for slivers of surplus, but for the right to steward. They argued in new tongues. If they could maintain the pumps and reroute the channels, why should control of water be anchored in animistic divinity rather than in living hands who knew the conduits? Naru argued this in public forums and found his voice swelling beyond the workshop. He began to speak of dignity, of the right to decide what one's labor builds and for whom. The Anunnakis responded with policy and philosophy. To cede control over the waters, they said, would be to risk the harmony of the star charts. Their calculations, calibrated over millennia, predicted chaos if each terrace acted on its own. The Igigis were offered committees, advisory roles, ritualized recognitions. It was progress, the hires said. They were teaching the Igigis how to govern, but the committees had little power and the rituals carried the chill of spectacle. The drought had made words into loose coins, spent and devalued, so the struggle escalated, subtly at first, and then with the clarity of black ink edicts. Workers in the lower terraces began to share knowledge openly. Children taught each other how to splice pipes. Elders edited schematics into songs. The Igigis' networks pulsed with information. They formed councils of caretakers that met in basements and in the damp hollows of abandoned cisterns. The councils spoke of more than water, about wood and bread, about law and labor. Their meetings were full of humor and sorrow both. Quick parodies of the Anunnaki's ceremonies intertwined with poems that retained a tenderness for the sky people's intelligence. Many Igigis still loved the hires. There was no simple hatred. But love can be an instrument of friction when it meets injustice. The tipping point came in a set of small, devastating incidents. A new edict from the palace required that a select list of Igigis be conscripted for purity maintenance of the star lenses. They were to be moved to higher altitudes, stripped of family ties, and placed under strict supervision. The lists were long on names and short on explanation. Those chosen found their family shunned. The edict was justified as responsive to an algal bloom, a contamination that threatened cosmic sight. But the Igigis who scrutinized the expenditures found that the hires had been stockpiling, grain in the same minute. Enraged, an underground coalition, no longer only Naru's small group, but a wide network of artisans, teachers, and storytellers, organized a strike. They would stop maintaining the lesser pumps and instead channel water into communal stores. The logic was simple and brutal. If the machines were not tended, the towers themselves would choke. It was also risky. Without maintenance, the valves that kept the city's sanctuaries cool would rust. Without tending, the star lenses might skew, and the Anunnakis could argue that the Igigis had endangered the cosmic order. When the strike began, the Anunnakis responded with an old weapon, denial of identity. They proclaimed the Igigis to be temporary helpers, born of whim without right to autonomous ordering. They enacted laws restricting movement, imposing curfews, and appointing overseers. They framed their actions as protective, as necessary sacrifice for the greater harmony of the spheres. Without order, an Anunnaki magistrate intoned in the public forum, the cosmos itself unravels. We cannot allow caprice to govern the flows. The strike hardened into a standoff. The Igigis handled it the way they knew best, with ingenuity. They made clandestine passageways to bypass patrols and safeguarded water caches with cunning locks. They also began to teach. Songs of the pumps and tales of the pipes became catechisms of autonomy. A child who knew the rhythm of valves when grown could teach another. Thus knowledge spread, and with it a quiet confidence. The sanctuary that had once been the Anunnakis' unassailable high ground, both literal and symbolic, was made vulnerable by the thing no law could entirely suppress: human, or Igigi solidarity. The Igigis, while not physically taller, were many and interconnected. They could, if they chose, immobilize engine after engine. They could, in time, convert palace gardens into fields for all. But the Igigis did not desire to destroy the Anunnakis. They desired a reordering. Skirmishes flared. A maintenance crew cut access to a palace cistern, and a high-born Anunnaki was nearly lost while cooling in a sanctuary. The Anunnakis retaliated by confiscating all tools from certain neighborhoods, by enforcing curfews with luminous barriers, and by packing the courts with charges of sedition. The Igigis responded not by matching force, but by multiplying resilience. If their spanners were seized, they made new ones. If voices were silenced, they sang louder. Word of the struggle radiated into the outlands, where tall grasses listened and winds carried the rumors like seeds. It was in the midst of this that the oldest Anunnaki, an elder named Enki, whose voice had once been used to calm thunderstorms, walked into the valley of the Igigis without ceremony. He did not come armored in proclamations. He came alone, and with a question that would mark the turning point in the first-class struggle recorded in the annals. Enki had watched the towers develop into something half-beautiful, half-crafted prison. He had seen the bright young ones churn with something like sorrow. He had felt, with a clarity that ages sometimes grant, the brittleness of the old order. He sought out the Igigis in the communal hall, where they gathered to repair a broken pump. He sat on a low stone and watched their hands move in practiced choreography. Naru was skeptical, so much so that he had his fingers curled around a wrench like a small sword. But when he saw the elder, he felt a memory of being a child and of being taught the names of the constellations by an Anunnaki with soft eyes. There had been kindness once before the drought. That memory frayed the anger for a moment. Enkiha did not instruct or condemn. He narrated. "I lived long," he said, "and I learned that laws without work are ghosts. I learned that to govern is to listen." His speech was not an apology. It was not posture. It was an acknowledgement. He spoke of how the Anunnakis' complex calculations had missed a simple truth. Systems survive when those who maintain them are trusted to care for them. "You teach your children tools," he said. "Let us teach them rights." At first, Naru could not trust the words. They were soft against scars. But Enkiha went further. He offered, publicly and with a certain vulnerability, the right of the Igigis to take part in municipal councils with real power, control over local water distribution, oversight of labor conditions, and a seat at the table to co-design the maintenance of apparatus. It was not everything the Igigis had demanded, but to many it felt like permission to imagine more. There was rejoicing, but rejoicing never cleanses all the old hurts. Not all Anunnakis agreed. In the palace quarters, those who feared dilution of order whispered that Enkiha had gone senile. Some of the Igigis called the concessions timid, wishing for more radical reconfigurations of resource control. And there were the most hardened among the Igigis who thought to use their new power first to punish. Naru insisted on restraint. The memory of a friend who had once been dragged away for sedition sat like a stone in his throat. He wanted a future where vengeance did not define the terms. The first councils were awkward in the way that all beginnings are awkward. Anunnakis and Igigis sat side by side, learning to measure not only their words but their silences. Old systems of hierarchy lingered in gestures, heads bowed too quickly, seats placed shallowly, the patterning of speech. The Igigis, however, brought expertise of a kind that was practical and immediate. They taught the Anunnakis how to prune the pipes to make them more efficient. They suggested rotating schedules so that no single person should toil alone night after night. They rewrote the maintenance logs into shared diagrams. The Anunnakis responded by sharing knowledge no longer hoarded. Engineering principles were opened up. Formerly, secret maps of the aquifers were redrawn with communal ink. But governance of scarcity is never linear. A winter came, and with it renewed challenges. The wells froze at odd depths. Crops withered under thin snows. Some hires, frustrated, eyed the shared stores with covetousness. A faction among the Anunnaki staged a conservative backlash, attempting to reclaim exclusive control over certain key valves. Tensions rose as ideology flirted with force. It was then that Naru initiated a different tactic: labor solidarity across difference. He called for the organization of combined brigades composed equally of Igigis and Anunnakis, who would repair the most vulnerable conduits together. It was a radical gesture, two former classes now working side by side not for the sake of tradition but for survival. Each brigade carried a banner made from fabrics both rough and silk, stitched by Igigi hands and embroidered by Anunnaki thread. The brigades performed feats of hydraulic ingenuity, reseating frozen valves and grafting new channels where necessary. Working together changed the way they saw each other. An Anunnaki, up to then guardant of theory, learned that sometimes the only precise instrument was the bent eye of an Igigi who had mended the same pump 3 generations in a row. And Igigi felt pride, not only in the fix, but in the knowledge that his skill was acknowledged by someone who had once seemed forever unreachable. The process did not erase memory of injustice, but it cultivated a shared sense of competence. Legally, the councils codified new rights: collective bargaining for laborers, mandated rest, transparent accounting for stores, and the right of any worker to call for an independent audit if exploitation was suspected. They set up neutral adjudicators, mixed panels composed in equal measure by both orders. These reforms had teeth. Violations of labor rights were now punishable not by decree, but by removal of privileges. And the Anunnakis' own scholars were deputized to verify compliance. Yet history insists on complications. Even as shared governance took root, subterranean economies blossomed. Black markets sold water at premiums. Smugglers, some Igigi, some Anunnaki, took advantage of coldly calculated shortages. Corruption is stubborn and knows how to survive the cleanings of new laws. The councils fought to contain this by insisting on decentralized provisioning. Local wells were empowered to operate autonomously with shared oversight. Decentralization, however, made some things messy and introduced new inequalities between neighborhoods with more talent and those with less. The most searing test came with a disease outbreak: fevered, cruel, attacking both Anunnaki and Igigi indiscriminately, but falling hardest on those already weakened by deprivation. Hospitals, once the preserve of the high sanctuaries, were overwhelmed. The strong veneer of the Anunnakis' self-proclaimed benevolence cracked. Their towers could not save everything. The councils reallocated personnel and resources, opening spaces in the palaces to those in need. Igigis and Anunnakis worked together in makeshift wards, discovering that the ethics of care were universal. Comfort could be given by any hand. This crisis forged a new solidarity. It also revealed social memory. Those who had allied had their contributions remembered. Those who hid or exploited were noted as well. Over time, myth-making began. The story propagated across generations that the first struggle had not been merely a skirmish between power and labor, but a crucible in which a new conception of kinship was hammered out. Songs tallied the names of those who had stitched pipes and those who had opened palace doors to sick feet. The songs became law in their way, binding memory to policy. Centuries later, when stones were annotated by scholars and children learned by reciting the great turning points, the first-class struggle was taught as both a caution and a promise. It cautioned against the comforts of enforced ignorance, that ignoring the hands that make daily life possible invites collapse. It promised that governance can be remade if enough people insist that those who labor be honored in decision-making. The victory, such as it was uneven. The Anunnakis retained heritable positions in certain cosmic functions. Their knowledge, refined over ages, remained essential. But the Igigis, once called merely hands, took their rightful names in municipal councils and guilds and in the recorded mythologies. Children born after the drought had access to communal education that taught both star mapping and valve repair. The language shifted. Titles lost the sting of contempt. Naru lived long enough to see benches in the forum carved with both high and low hands, a literal flattening of some old separations. He was not lionized in the way epic heroes are, for his leadership had been practical and modest. He married twice, mended rivers and marriages with equal fervor, taught a generation of technicians who would become teachers. He died with a wrench at his side, the tool worn and gleaming in a way that said its owner had used it well. Enkiha died soon after, smiling at a valley that now hummed with a new order. Their funerals were congregations where songs and laws were recited together. The Anunnaki singing of stars, the Igigis reciting diagrams. The sky sighed as if relieved, but the story did not end with fixed laws and peaceful work brigades. Inequities would re-emerge in other forms, new droughts would test new systems, and the slow sediment of prejudice never fully dissolved. The point, the survivors agreed, was not to win once and for all, but to develop institutions resilient enough to change with time, councils that could be reviewed, rights that could be broadened, education that could be refreshed. In time, a new custom grew. Each year, on a day when the sky was neither too dark nor too bright, the people of the valley, Anunnaki and Igigis, their children and their children's children, would gather at a shared well. They would open the valves together. They would sing songs of repair and remember both those who had stolen and those who had healed. They would pass tools from palm to palm, a ritual of exchange that said, "Hands matter. So do those who wield them." This ritual mattered because it encoded humility into the community's bones. It reminded each generation that talent without responsibility is brittle, and that authority without accountability breeds its own quiet rebellions. To listen, to learn, and to labor together, that became the new creed. Whether it was etched in laws or hummed in lullabies, it persisted. Long after the physical scars faded, the valley retained a kind of architecture of memory. Statues were rare. The Anunnakis disliked them. But there were markers, a bronze spanner leaning against a carved star, a communal logbook with pages that showed both water levels and votes. Stories passed in the evenings, how an old Anunnaki named Enkiha had walked into a basement, how an Igigi named Naru had chosen restraint, how cooks in the low terraces had fed strangers before they fed themselves. These stories taught more than history. They taught orientation toward cooperation under the pressure of scarcity. The first-class struggle of history, then, was not an ending, but the beginning of a long experiment. It asked whether systems of power could be redesigned by those who, for generations, had been told that the world was fixed. It found that power, when met with organized skill and moral imagination, could be persuaded to change. It found that dignity could be demanded without destroying beauty, that the maintenance of wonder requires those who create it to also be cared for. People who lived 1,000 years later would sometimes stand on terraces and look up at towers that still glittered, at machines that still pulsed, and ask whether the division of labor had ever truly ended. The answer varied with the teller, but most would pause and say the struggle had taught them to listen. It had taught them to measure not only outputs, but who counted when decisions were made. The Igigis and the Anunnakis in that ancient valley had learned that the stars were no excuse to forget the soil. If one walked the old streets at dawn, when menders rubbed sleep from their eyes and children chased one another with brass orbs, one could hear an old tune, half work song, half litany, rising from doorways. The tune was simple: hands and stars, hands and stars. In it was the truth of what the valley had earned, an imperfect peace, a shared labor, and a belief that when the next drought came, they would meet it together, not as masters in hands, but as neighbors who had learned how to build a future with both sky and soil in mind.